Hello all, I'm Dominique Hazaël-Massieux, on stage this time not with my board hat, but my team hat, in particular as the VP of Global Impact. The goal of this presentation is to summarize what has been happening as part of the strategic initiative on the impact framework, familiarize you all on why we are having an impact framework, what it's going to look like, and how we expect it to influence how we think about W3C and how we put this into operations. So the charter for the Impact Framework Strategic Initiative tasked us with enabling us to qualitatively and quantitatively define, analyze, and communicate our impact. That may seem very abstract, but the task force, so we were 3 persons or 4 persons on the task force, Simone, not Simono, Avnish and Jeffrey. The people on the task force were looking at making sure W3C understands how to present and measure its impact. And the reason why it's important for a nonprofit such as W3C to look at impact rather than anything else is that as a non-for-profit, it's not our ability to bring revenues in that is our measure of success. It's how well and how much we are accomplishing the mission for which we are set up that is our measure of success. And to some extent, many of you might say, well, W3C has been around for 30 years. By many measures, we've been a pretty successful organization in bringing up standards, in changing the web, hopefully for the better. And all of this has happened without such a framework. And in practice, how has it happened? Very much using a bottom-up approach where the membership, the community comes up with problems that they feel they can best address in W3C. And this leads to the creation of working groups, which then leads to the creation of standard and specification. And so that part has been going great. But that bottom-up approach has one deficiency, that it works great in addressing the problems that the community brings up on its own when people feel that they are empowered to do so. It doesn't work as well as we actually heard, I think, during the previous discussion with the tag, in identifying which gaps needs to be addressed beyond what's coming up from this bottom-up approach. So why a framework then to approach that question? W3C right now is at a pretty good place in terms of identifying its overall mission, thanks to the work of both the advisory board and the technical architecture group on the vision for the web and the ethical web principles. We have, I think, a fairly clear ideas in terms of the high-level goals we want to achieve as an organization. And again, based on our process, based on our operational aspects, we know how to come up with short-term agreements on what it is that we want to accomplish together, typically through the chartering process. But the connection between these high-level goals from the vision documents and the charters that are expected to accomplish that vision has a gap. There isn't a direct linkage between the two. And really, the purpose of the framework that I will be describing is to make sure we keep a strong linkage between these high-level goals and the low-level directions to make sure both that what we do on a day-to-day basis aligns with our goals and that the goals we have matching work that actually help move the needle. So the proposal that the task force has landed on is to use as a basis for this impact framework what is called the theory of change. So this will be a very short and superficial introduction to what the theory of change is. You'll also get a chance to get more familiar with it in the second part of this session where we will be more hands-on. But basically the theory of change is a model where you identify the goals you want to achieve, and from there you derive what are the intermediary steps that needs to be accomplished to make that vision true. And in particular, it's very anchored into as much logical and scientific causality as possible. When you develop this type of framework, one question is always who will that be useful for, who will be using it. Our strong intent with this approach is to make this a community-owned framework. It's not something that we feel is, for instance, only for external parties or funders. We really want this to serve the community with the impact framework so that the community gets greater visibility and understanding about where we are and where we need to go to accomplish our mission. What I call both a mirror, what are the things that we say we would do but aren't doing, or the things we would do and aren't doing as well as we should, and also a compass, figuring out where we need to put more energy, more resources to accelerate in a given direction. So on screen, a simple diagram to illustrate this theory of change. The idea is that you start from the top with your impact, the vision that you're trying to achieve. And from there, you try and derive what are the prerequisites that are needed to make that vision true. So if you start from a very high-level statement, we want one interoperable web, what needs to be true for this to either become true or remain true over time. So in the theory of change, this is called outcomes. And some of it is directly under our control, and some of it is only under our influence. And so basically, the theory of change forces you to think about where is it that our work has a direct connection to the expected outcome, and where is it that you need to work with other organizations, other bodies, to actually achieve what you want. So going from this impact and vision down to outcomes, down to output, which is what W3C itself is tasked with delivering based on the activities that W3C itself pushes, and based on the resources and input that make this all possible. So to make it possible to use that framework, the first step is to be more specific about the actual impacts we feel W3C seeks to achieve. To do that, we basically took the work already done, again, by the advisory board and the technical architecture group in the vision and the ethical web principles, and turned what was highlighted there in terms of how would the world be, and how would humanity, which is ultimately our expected beneficiaries of our work, how would the world be if we fully achieved our mission? And we've come up with a series of 11 impact statements, which I'm not offering to review in depth just now. You will get a chance to compare your own analysis of our vision and our work to this statement in the second part of this session. But for instance, the one statement on which we've so far spent the most time in the context of the task force, people around the world experience and enjoy a single unified web that works consistently across devices, browsers, and platforms, ensuring users can fully choose the tools they want to interact with the web. And so once you take that, one statement over the 11 that we've come up with, the question that we ask to people helping us develop the framework is, what are the prerequisites to make that statement true over time? How far are we from it? What needs to change to make sure this becomes true? So again, I won't get into the details of the 11 statements, but if you look at them on the slides, you will see that they intend to cover all of the ideas raised in the vision for the web and the ethical web principles. So to get us to the next stage again of how would you use those impact statements, so starting from, again, this first statement that I gave as an example, so what would be the prerequisites again, in theory of change speak, the outcomes that W3C seeks. And again, this is based on some of the early input we've been gathering from both task force members and volunteers that we called for a few weeks ago. So if you want to have people around the world experience and enjoy a single and unified web, well, you need interoperable implementation of web specifications. You need implementations that are verified to work across devices, across platforms, across implementation environments. You need wide and open access to multiple independent implementation across the globe. You need web technologies that are providing an attractive platform for content and service providers. Like if we have the best technologies in the world, but nobody uses them because they prefer using proprietary platforms, we've not really accomplished our mission. We've delivered great technologies that nobody uses. So that's a set of examples of, again, these prerequisites you can derive from the impact statement. Once you have these prerequisites, the question becomes, what can W3C do to make this prerequisite true? What is the W3C output that supports that part of our mission? So some of them are, I think, completely unsurprising. Yes, royalty-free standards are key in creating an open and interoperable web. Some of them are maybe implicit in some of the things we've done, but not really recognized, I think, as directly as part of our mission. So, for instance, interoperability monitoring. Right now, in our operations, we check interoperability typically before going to recommendation or throughout the candidate recommendation process. But we haven't really integrated the idea that it's not just a one-time thing that we need to do, but that's really part of our mission is making sure not only we get this one stage where we can say a subset of the features have gotten independent implementations, we actually want these features to be fully adoptable, fully used by developers out there, which I think has the Web Platform Test Interop project has demonstrated, requires a lot more effort than just saying, yeah, we checked a few boxes back 2 years ago. And some of the discussions we've had around the credential testing environment have surfaced exactly the same notion that interoperability monitoring is not just a one-time thing. It's really something where W3C might benefit from bringing more support and attention. Likewise, making sure the implementations don't just work on the places where it's easy to test, but that it works on places where people will need to use these technologies, I think is one thing you can derive from the statement. What additional support can we do to avoid technology fragmentation and siloization? I think this maps to some of the discussions we had around why it's useful for W3C to engage with policy makers, for instance, to make sure our technologies aren't stopped by different regulations that would stop at the border. And the broader point about making sure web technologies are providing an attractive platform to content and service providers. Again, we've been doing this in an ad hoc fashion, using various processes to surface ideas through incubation and so on. But we've rarely done a structured gap analysis of how and why do content and service providers choose to go with proprietary technologies versus web technologies. And I think there is here likely useful work that we could do in this community, again, to answer some of the questions we had this morning about what should be driving our technical strategy. And again, these are examples that have emerged from the discussions. By no means I will claim that this is complete or even correct, but the reason I'm presenting this is to show what I expect the value of using this more structured approach at understanding our impact can lead us to recognize and act upon. And once we've identified these outcomes and outputs that represent what we as a community want to achieve, then you can start and put up indicators that tells you, are you on track? Are we achieving progress in these various fields? So again, giving a few examples of things we could look at. So how many W3C specified features have been adopted by major implementations? Last year in Sophia Antipolis, for those of you who were there, we had a report from the WebDX community group, which came up with this notion of baseline availability for web platform features, which is a really interesting indicator of how successful are we in getting stuff not just specced, but actually adopted and deployed in the real world. Because one of the messages we regularly hear is that, yeah, it's great if you have a spec, but if I can only use it in 10% of my market, then I really won't be using it. Another potential indicator, how many of our features have been verified across devices and platforms. Again, for instance, the WPT infrastructure right now is completely focused on desktop or I guess PC level of browser testing. While we do know that there are challenges in getting some of our specs adopted in mobile, or they may have a different performance profile. And so again, there may be here a useful indicator to track our progress in making sure we're not too centric on a specific environment. I won't go through the whole list, but again, just a few illustrations of how we can start looking not just at, yes, we are, we have a bunch of ideas, we do good progress on them, which I think is very true, but also how can we take a more systematic approach to ensuring we progress towards those shared goals that we have identified. So in terms of where we are with this framework and the task force, so I presented to you the initial statements we came up with. We are working again with this set of volunteers from the community, from both the advisory committee chairs and other members of the community on reviewing the statements, understanding how it relates to their work. We expect to release a new version of the statements based on that input. Part of this, I think, will be migrating the work that so far has been happening in the initiative repo on a repo on its own, a public repo open for a much broader community input, now that I think we have at least a workable basis. And once that's done, I think the goal will be for an initial release of the framework, which will be, of course, very imperfect with draft indicators, but something that people can complain about. That, to me, is a way of making sure we achieve progress, is getting something in front of the community that people can react to, suggest changes, improvements, corrections to. So once we have that draft framework out in terms of how we will operationalize it, I think in a day-to-day basis, again, we will come up with these indicators, which I expect we will want to report on a regular basis. So each year we'll have to face a mirror telling us, this year we've seen that many new features gaining broad interoperability, or we've seen that many features gaining actual accessible implementations, or we've seen that many languages gaining actual support across different environments, and so on and so forth. Another effort will be, as we look at both our existing work and new work, making sure we understand how we tie that work back to the impact we seek to have, just so that we are clear with ourselves that we're not just doing work in a vacuum, but that we are able to articulate in a crisp fashion that this particular piece of work contributes to that particular shared goal that we've identified. And maybe more importantly, and perhaps more challengingly, identify things where nobody has come up with proposals. I'll give maybe one simple example. One of the impact statements is about making sure people in low resource regions can fully take advantage of web technologies. Well, if you ask me what group is helping there, I mean, maybe squinting, you could say web performance is helping a bit, and maybe CSS because it's helping with more decorative approaches. But we don't really have a systematic way of assessing whether the situation is improving. And by many indicators, if you look at the rapid rise of the weight of web pages, we're probably actually not helping people in low resources regions where they may have less network or devices with less memory. So again, whether or not W3C is well positioned to address that gap, I think would be the conversation, but enabling the conversation is really what the framework would be about. And the additional step here will be also to move away from this small task force that we use to basically create the structure for the impact framework, to move it to a community-owned and managed task force. Our current expectations, and there is still a lot of TBD there, but our current expectations is that it would make sense for the governance bodies to be particularly represented in such a task force to get ownership of the impact framework. But that's one of the bits where the task force still needs to come up with a more specific proposal for review. Right after this presentation, my colleague Simone will put you to work, both to get you maybe more familiar with what it takes to put this impact framework in application, link it back to your own understanding of our work, of our mission. So we will be splitting in small tables in Zoom in small breakouts to facilitate both individual and group discussion on that work, to get your insights about where W3C is and needs to go using that approach. But before we get there, first I'll be happy to take a few questions, assuming I have time. And we also are very much looking for feedback. You can send feedback by email directly to me. We have the initiatives report right now where the impact framework is being developed, so very much looking for input. I want to thank again both the members of the task force and the volunteers who've already helped highlight a number of really insightful questions about how to use and operationalize that framework.